infrastructure and grant cuts diverge significantly from 2021 bipartisan infrastructure law, which focused on roads, bridges, broadband, public transit, and climate resilience. Backing up. Experience delayed treatments, worse outcomes for strokes, heart attacks, trauma, labor/delivery, and chronic conditions. This impacts not just Medicaid recipients, but Medicare recipients as well. The most deeply impacted are the least resource counties: Washington, Martin, Northampton, Tyrrell, Hyde, Bladen, and Robeson, mostly red counties. People 7 to 10, sit down, you're dead.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
SNAP and food cuts. 1.42 million people rely on SNAP monthly. That's about 13% of North Carolina residents. This includes 650,000 children, seniors, and individuals with disabilities, with 4 and 5 SNAP families having one or more of these members. Bill impacts, administrative burdens, and paperwork have cut 375,000 people on benefits, with average losses of $234 a month. Persons 11 to 14, sit down,
12,
you're dead.
13, 14.
SNAP drives $2.8 billion in North Carolina's economy each year, often yielding $1.50 or $1.50 to $1.80 in local spending for every benefit dollar. Cuts could threaten about $313,000 in federal support to small local nonprofits. Example, Chatham County's Cora. SNAP supports 9,200 retailers across North Carolina. Fewer benefits mean less revenue for local grocers and farmers, yielding growing food deserts. Person 15, sit down, you're dead. Disaster recovery and FEMA aid cuts. FEMA is now rolling back the full 100% cost share. State and local governments must cover 10% of the cost. 10 cents on the dollar after the extension ends. North Carolina officials estimate this shift could cost the state an additional $200 million for Helene recovery, just for debris cleanup and emergency response. Delays in debris removal, search and rescue, and emergency shelter mean more people who are trapped in unsafe homes, exposed to contaminated water, mold, collapsed structures. People waiting longer for ambulances or evacuation. In past North Carolina disasters like Hurricanes Matthew, Florence, and Helene, timely FEMA aid saved lives. Delays could reverse that. Prolonged outages in electricity and water due to slow recovery equals higher risk of heat stroke, dehydration, and waterborne diseases. Emergency shelters may not open fast enough or stay open long enough, especially in rural or low-income areas. Vulnerable areas rural transit are likely at risk due to federal reprioritization. Bus rapid transit, BRT, BERT, projects such as Chapel Hills, NSBRT, $24 million in federal funding may stall or scale back component build-out if federal support shrinks. Raleigh's Newbern Avenue BERT delay, no bids, highlights resilience on future federal investments. Rural systems benefiting under road and rural transit must contend with reduced capital program grants likely resulting from the bill. Housing and community development, 44% reduction in HUD's overall budget. Let me say that again, 44% reduction in HUD's overall budget. Slashing critical programs like rental assistance, public housing operations, homeless support, and senior disability housing. Community development block grants, CDBG, home investment partnerships, and fair housing initiative programs face full elimination. Block grants transformed into state-administered programs with 2-year caps, meaning less federal oversight, potentially inconsistent state redistribution, resilience, and FEMA grants. Without CDBG or homes, small towns in North Carolina lose funding for local rehab, infrastructure, and housing projects. Rural and underrepresented areas face increased risk of homelessness and fewer support services. Nonprofits and public housing agencies could lose jobs and capacity as federal grant funding evaporates. The National Alliance to End Homelessness warned a 43 to 44% HUD cut could raise homelessness by 37%. Budget downdrafts and service gaps. North Carolina receives roughly $30 billion annually in federal funding. Discretionary cuts cause cascading shortfalls across transportation, education, health, housing, and agriculture. Local governments may face tax increases, service reductions, teacher-student ratio changes, road maintenance delays to fill gaps. Impacts on people. North Carolina has 550,000 people living in FEMA-designated flood zones. Cuts to mitigation efforts make their homes and lives more vulnerable. About 600,000 people relying on small rural water systems may experience degraded water quality or outages. An estimated 250,000 North Carolinians rely on rural transit each year without it. They're stuck in place during crisis events. People 17 to 22, sit down, you're dead.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Budget shortfalls, risks, and state response impact. North Carolina gets about 30% of funds from the federal government in order to run the state and federal dollars. Make up around $23.9 billion of the North Carolina DHHS budget, more than 70% of its total. In K through 12 education, about 17% of funds, $3.5 billion come from federal sources. North Carolina House budget has already reduced funding for the Healthy Opportunities Program. That goes to food, transportation, housing services for Medicaid recipients. Cut state support for a planned children's hospital, redirecting services. Safety net programs slowed or shuttered. Rural, elderly, and low-income residents face cuts in food, housing, Medicaid, and transit services. Programs that improved health outcomes like healthy opportunities and free school meals are particularly vulnerable. Local services primed for cutbacks. With federal pass-through reduced, local governments may have to raise taxes or reduce public safety school funding, mental health services, and road maintenance. Person 23, sit down, you're dead. We're not finished. Environmental impacts. Slashing EPA funding and environmental oversight. The bill has 40% environmental oversight. The bill has 40% cut to EPA funding. Its lowest level since the 1990s, with deep cuts to enforcement science, environmental justice programs, and infrastructure grants. State revolving funds for clean water, wastewater would drop by close to $300 million, jeopardizing essential water infrastructure in North Carolina. These cuts make it more likely industries could dump pollutants with less oversight, raising the risk of unsafe air and drinking water. Rolling back clean energy and climate protection. Deep cuts to renewable energy programs, funding for the Department of Energy's DOE Clean Energy R&D, including solar, wind, battery storage, and grid modernization. It is slashed by 30 to 40% compared to recent budgets. Reduction or elimination of tax credits and grants that support solar installations, wind farms, and electric vehicle incentives nationwide. This will slow the growth of North Carolina's expanding solar and wind sector, which currently contributes thousands of jobs and economic activity. Threatening wildlife, biodiversity, and public lands. Fish and Wildlife Services budgets cut by over 25%, along with the rollback of National Park Service funding, hurting conservation efforts and public recreation. Writers undermine the Endangered Species Act. Particularly putting North Carolinians at risk. Mandated fossil fuel drilling and mining lease expansions threaten public lands and increase greenhouse gas emissions. Diminish protections for environmental justice communities. The budget halts EPA's ability to enforce environmental justice initiatives, tackling inequity in polluted or underserved areas. Such communities, often in eastern North Carolina counties, would lose critical support in addressing health risks from contamination and inadequate infrastructure, weakened regulatory authority and permitting oversight, clean water air rules, mercury emission standards, methane restrictions, and lead paint enforcement are restricted or blocked. NEPA permitting process is streamlined, curtailing environmental reviews and public input. This could lower barriers to oil, gas, logging, and mining projects, increasing environmental risks in North Carolina watersheds and forests. Public health and climate consequences. Air pollution rises, contributing to asthma, cardiovascular disease, and other conditions like mental health, especially in urban areas like Charlotte, Asheville, and Wilmington. Clean water access is threatened, raising risks of contamination in both urban and rural areas relying on state-backed infrastructure. Increased flooding, heat waves, and storms due to unchecked climate change. North Carolina's coastal and inland regions would see worsened impacts without mitigation investments. Low income, elderly, and Black, Latino, and rural communities and Native are disproportionately harmed by higher exposure to pollutants, less access to health care and cooling centers, less capacity to rebuild after climate disasters. Person 24, sit down, you're dead. STEM innovation, significant cuts to federal research budgets for agencies like the National Science Foundation, 55% cut. The National Institute of Health, 40% budget cut. NASA Science Directorate, 52% cut. NOAA, 26% cut. CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, 44% cut. These cuts reduce grant funding for universities and national labs, including North Carolina's major research hubs such as Duke University, UNC Chapel Hill, North Carolina State University, Research Triangle Park Initiative, economic and workforce impacts in the Triangle. RTP, a national hub, relies on $2 billion from NIH and life sciences, employing 75,000 people in North Carolina. Cuts could eliminate 25,000 plus jobs statewide, with at least $5 billion lost in a downstream economic activity. Startups, service industries, and state biotech firms, RTI International, dependent on federal R&D, would feel the squeeze. Why this matters long term. Medical breakthroughs, slower progress on vaccines, cancer drugs, diagnostics. Economic competitiveness, U.S. risks losing innovative edge. Other nations expand investments while ours contract. State budget strain, lost federal money means fewer tax revenues and tougher economy recovery for North Carolina. Social equity, reducing funding for diversity initiatives harms underrepresented STEM students. Person 25, sit down, you're dead. Increases ICE enforcement support. It broadens ICE's ability to detain and deport undocumented immigrants, including provisions that streamline processes and reduce judicial oversight. Certain accountability measures and oversight provisions on ICE practices are reduced or eliminated, raising concerns among immigrant advocacy groups. The bill allocates over $100 billion to ICE through 2029, encompassing $45 billion for constructing new immigration prisons, including family detention facilities, $46 billion for border wall operations and related infrastructure, $14 billion for deportation activities and enforcement operations, $10 billion for hiring and compensating 10,000 new ICE agents with a proposed $10,000 annual bonus per agent. We know that impacting the undocumented impacts all immigrants. When grandma's disappeared, when dad has disappeared, the whole family is impacted. Persons 26 through 34, leave the square. Leave the square. You are disappeared.
Gary.
There are 34 people dead or disappeared so that the wealthy in our country can have a large tax savings. Let me repeat, we are sacrificing 34%, or 3.74 million people, North Carolinians, that will either directly or indirectly die or be disappeared as a result of these cuts. Persons 35 through 95, turn around and sit down.
I saw you.
You think this bill does no harm to you? It does. When 34% of us are hurt or gone, you will feel it, friends and neighbors. They may have been people that planted, grew, and picked your fruit and vegetables. PFAS should be in your water. You or your family is suffering from asthma because ozone is back from lack of regulation and burning more fossil fuels. Wildfires go longer and burn more because there aren't people to manage our national state parks and monitor for fires, let alone put them out. Research that helps you survive a cancer diagnosis is gone, and the life-saving medicines weren't developed to save you. What are you going to do for work when you are laid off because of grant cuts? Are you going to be able to afford an electric bill that is 18% or more higher? We walked away from green, renewable energy. Persons 96 through 100, the wealthy. You represent the wealthiest 5% people in North Carolina. The tax provisions help you most. You will still be impacted, but you will have the funds to overcome the issues the rest of the remaining people have to deal with. All of this was a choice, one that even Senator Tom Tillis realized was too much. But every other Republican in North Carolina backed, every single one. Remember this in 2026? Remember how the suffering of the 95% was ignored for the 5% of the wealthiest North Carolinians. Remember.
I don't have bumps.